The French philosopher Voltaire once delivered what is arguably the most devastating and accurate roast in the history of geopolitics. He looked at the sprawling, chaotic mass of territory dominating the center of Europe and declared that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, and he was absolutely right. If you look at a map of Europe today, you see neatly defined borders. But if you look at a map of Central Europe in the year 1648, it looks like someone took a stained glass window, smashed it with a hammer, and glued the pieces back together while blindfolded. This was the Holy Roman Empire. For 1,000 years, this absolute monstrosity of a political system dominated European history. It was a geopolitical Frankenstein's monster, a bizarre, decentralized fever dream of overlapping territories, petty princes, militant bishops, and a chronically broke emperor who usually had zero actual power to tell anyone what to do. It was a system so unbelievably complicated and dysfunctional that the fact it survived for a millennium is a miracle of bureaucratic stubbornness. Welcome back to Day's Dog, where today we are diving headfirst into the ultimate historical paradox. We are going to unpack the massive 1,000-year joke that was the Holy Roman Empire, discovering how it started as a desperate plea for protection, evolved into a terrifying European superpower, and slowly decomposed into an administrative punchline. To understand the punchline, we have to go back to the setup, which begins on Christmas Day in the year 800 AD. The original Roman Empire had collapsed in the West centuries ago, leaving a massive power vacuum. Europe was essentially a post-apocalyptic wasteland of warring Germanic tribes. Down in Rome, the Pope had a serious problem. He was supposed to be the spiritual leader of the Christian world, but the city of Rome was violent. The political factions were trying to literally gouge his eyes out, and he had no army to protect himself. The Pope needed a bodyguard. Looking north, he saw the Franks, a massive, powerful kingdom ruled by a brilliant warlord named Charlemagne. So, the Pope made a highly controversial, incredibly audacious political gamble. As Charlemagne was kneeling in prayer in St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope sneaked up behind him and placed a crown on his head, declaring him the Emperor of the Romans. This was a brilliant scam. The Pope got a massive army to protect him, and Charlemagne, a Germanic king whose ancestors were considered unwashed barbarians by the original Romans, suddenly got the ultimate VIP title, linking his bloodline to the legacy of the Caesars. The only problem was that the actual Roman Empire still existed in the East, in Constantinople, and they were absolutely furious that the Pope was handing out their copyright to some guy in a fur cloak. But the precedent was set. The title of Roman Emperor in the West was back, but it wasn't Roman at all. It was distinctly German. After Charlemagne's death, his empire violently fractured, but the concept of the title survived. Fast forward to the year 962, and another powerful German king, Otto I, marched down into Italy, saved the Pope from his local enemies, and got himself crowned emperor. This is the moment the Holy Roman Empire truly begins as a continuous, functioning institution. Otto established the core dynamic that would define the empire for the next 1,000 years. It was an unholy marriage between German military muscle and Italian spiritual legitimacy. But right away, the fatal flaw of the empire was exposed. If the Pope crowns the emperor, who is actually in charge? The holy part of the Holy Roman Empire was supposed to mean that the emperor was God's secular sword on earth. But what happens when the sword and the church disagree? This led to one of the most intense and ridiculous political standoffs in history, known as the investiture controversy. In the 11th century, Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII got into a massive ego clash over who had the right to appoint bishops. Bishops weren't just priests back then. They were incredibly wealthy land managers who controlled massive armies. Henry basically told the Pope that he was a fake monk and needed to step down. The Pope responded by pulling the ultimate medieval trump card. He excommunicated the emperor. Suddenly, all of Henry's subjects were legally absolved from obeying him. His nobles immediately started plotting a rebellion, realizing the emperor was suddenly stripped of all his divine authority. Panicking, Henry was forced to cross the freezing Alps in the dead of winter in 1077, wearing nothing but a hair shirt, and stand barefoot in the snow outside the Pope's castle at Canossa for 3 straight days, begging for forgiveness. It was the most humiliating apology in human history. The Pope eventually forgave him, but the damage was permanent. The emperors realized they couldn't control the church, and the church realized the emperors would always try to dominate them. The Holy Roman Empire was fundamentally broken at its spiritual core, destined to spend centuries fighting civil wars between papal supporters and imperial loyalists. While the emperors were busy fighting the Pope in Italy, things back home in Germany were spiraling completely out of control. Because the emperor was always away on campaigns, he had to bribe the local German princes to keep them loyal. He gave them land. He gave them the right to collect tolls. He gave them the right to mint their own coins. Over the centuries, the emperors accidentally gave away the farm. The Holy Roman Empire mutated into a decentralized nightmare. It wasn't a single country. It was a loose confederation of over 300 semi-independent microstates. You had massive duchies, tiny little baronies the size of a golf course, independent merchant cities that answered to no one, and territories ruled by warrior bishops. It was an administrative fever dream. If you were a merchant trying to travel down the Rhine River to sell some grain, you had to stop and pay a different toll to a different local lord every 10 miles, dealing with 30 different currencies. To make matters worse, the title of emperor wasn't hereditary. It was an elected position. In 1356, the rules of this chaotic game were formalized in a document called the Golden Bull. It declared that exactly 7 elite men, known as the Prince-Electors, had the exclusive right to choose the next emperor. This meant that every time an emperor died, a massive, corrupt political auction took place. The candidates had to bribe the electors with astronomical amounts of gold, land, and privileges to win their votes. This ensured that the emperor was almost always deeply in debt and politically compromised before he even put the crown on his head. The electors didn't want a strong emperor who could tell them what to do. They wanted a weak figurehead who would leave them alone. The Holy Roman Empire became an empire designed entirely around the concept of not being ruled. But then, the Habsburgs arrived, and they found a glitch in the matrix. The House of Habsburg was originally a relatively minor, noble family from Switzerland, but they realized that fighting wars in this chaotic empire was a waste of money. The real path to absolute dominance was through the bedroom. They mastered the art of dynastic marriage. There was a famous saying, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." They married into the royal houses of Burgundy, Bohemia, Hungary, and eventually Spain. By the 16th century, a Habsburg named Charles V inherited an empire so incomprehensibly massive it defied logic. Through sheer genetic luck and strategic weddings, Charles became the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Spain, the ruler of the Netherlands, and the master of the newly discovered Americas. He was the most powerful man on earth, but his reign was an absolute nightmare. Charles spent his entire life desperately rushing across Europe on horseback, trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. He was fighting the French in Italy, fighting the expanding Ottoman Empire in the east, and trying to manage the chaotic mess of German princes back in the Holy Roman Empire. And just when Charles thought his job couldn't possibly get any worse, a stubborn, angry monk with a hammer walked up to a church door in Wittenberg and completely shattered the universe. When Martin Luther sparked the Protestant Reformation in 1517, he didn't just challenge the Pope's theology, he handed the German princes the ultimate political weapon. Up until this point, the Catholic Church was the only cultural glue holding the Holy Roman Empire together. When Luther translated the Bible into German and declared that the Pope was a fraud, dozens of German princes immediately converted to Protestantism. They didn't just do this out of religious conviction, they did it because it allowed them to seize all the massively wealthy Catholic Church lands within their territories and stop paying taxes to Rome. Charles V, a devout Catholic, was horrified. He tried to crush the Protestant princes, leading to decades of brutal religious warfare. Eventually, exhausting himself and his treasury, Charles was forced to sign the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. This treaty established a bizarre rule: whose realm, his religion. It meant that whatever prince ruled a specific piece of land got to choose the religion for everyone living there. If you were a Catholic living in a Protestant prince's land, you either converted or moved. It was a band-aid solution that essentially baked a ticking time bomb directly into the constitutional framework of the empire. That bomb detonated in 1618, starting the absolute worst catastrophe in European history prior to the World Wars, the 30 Years' War. It began in Prague, when a group of angry Protestant nobles threw 3 Catholic imperial officials out of a third-story castle window, an event famously known as the Defenestration of Prague. Miraculously, the officials survived the 70-foot fall, allegedly because they landed in a massive pile of horse manure, but the empire immediately plunged into total apocalyptic chaos. The 30 Years' War wasn't just a religious conflict, it was a free-for-all massacre. Every major power in Europe smelled blood and jumped into the Holy Roman Empire to grab a piece of land. The Swedes marched down from the north, the French attacked from the west, and the Spanish marched up from the south. The entire German countryside was turned into a scorched earth battleground. Massive mercenary armies roamed the landscape, and because the kings paying them were completely broke, these armies sustained themselves by systematically looting, torturing, and murdering the civilian population. If a mercenary company surrounded a village, they would burn the crops, steal the cattle, and commit unspeakable atrocities to extort hidden gold from the peasants. The sheer scale of the devastation is hard to comprehend. Some regions of the Holy Roman Empire lost over 50% of their entire population to violence, starvation, and plague. Villages were left completely abandoned, reclaimed by wolves. It was an era of absolute darkness, proving that the empire could not protect its own citizens. In fact, the imperial structure was the very thing trapping them in this endless cycle of violence. By the time the exhausted, traumatized powers of Europe finally signed the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 to end the war, the Holy Roman Empire was essentially a corpse. The treaty officially recognized the independence of the hundreds of German princes. The emperor was now reduced to a ceremonial mascot. He had a fancy title and a cool crown, but he couldn't raise an imperial army, he couldn't levy imperial taxes, and he couldn't pass laws without the unanimous consent of a parliamentary body called the Imperial Diet, which was famous for debating for literally years without ever actually deciding anything. The Holy Roman Empire spent the next century and a half operating as a political zombie. It existed on paper, but in reality, powerful states within the empire, like Prussia and Austria, just ignored the imperial rules and acted like fully independent, aggressive nations. It took a man with a massive ego and an unmatched artillery doctrine to finally put the dying dog out of its misery. When Napoleon Bonaparte exploded out of France and started conquering Europe in the early 19th century, he looked at the archaic, confusing map of the Holy Roman Empire and laughed. Napoleon didn't have time for thousand-year-old traditions, Prince-Electors, or ceremonial titles. He systematically smashed the Austrian armies and began consolidating the hundreds of tiny German microstates into larger, more manageable puppet kingdoms that answered directly to France. In 1806, recognizing that the empire was entirely obsolete and thoroughly humiliated, the last Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, officially dissolved it. He abdicated the throne, packed up the ancient crown jewels, and the 1,000-year-old institution vanished with a stroke of a pen. The Holy Roman Empire was, in many ways, an impossible contradiction. It was an empire without a capital, a state without a centralized government, and a superpower that was completely incapable of defending itself. It was mocked by philosophers, torn apart by religious zealots, and ultimately erased by a French artillery officer. Yet its legacy is undeniable. The decentralized chaos of the empire prevented Central Europe from forming a unified nation-state for centuries, allowing the cultural, scientific, and artistic diversity of the German states to flourish in a strange, competitive vacuum. It was the ultimate geopolitical survivor, adapting, fracturing, and mutating just enough to keep itself alive century after century. It may have been a 1000-year joke, but it was a joke that fundamentally shaped the borders, the religions, and the history of the modern world.